The humid air of Ouagadougou pressed against the bulletproof windows of the black Mercedes as Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the encrypted files on his tablet. The red dust of Burkina Faso's capital swirled outside, but his mind was elsewhere, focused on the intelligence reports that had been flooding in all week. Something wasn't right. After 2 years of leading the country through its most turbulent period, his instincts had become razor-sharp, and right now, every fiber of his being screamed danger. "Sir, we're approaching the presidential compound," announced Colonel Marcus Diabra from the passenger seat, his voice steady but his eyes constantly scanning the streets through his tactical sunglasses. Marcus had been with Ibrahim since their military academy days, rising through the ranks together, sharing foxholes during the northern insurgency campaigns. If there was anyone Ibrahim trusted with his life, it was Marcus. The convoy of 3 identical Mercedes vehicles moved through the checkpoint with practiced precision. Ibrahim's vehicle was in the center, flanked by security teams that had cost the state nearly $8 million to assemble and train. These weren't ordinary bodyguards. They were elite operatives, hand-picked from various international security agencies, each with a spotless record and loyalty verified through months of psychological evaluation and background checks. As they pulled into the compound's courtyard, Ibrahim noticed something that made his blood run cold. The usual rotation of guards wasn't at their posts. Instead, he saw faces he didn't immediately recognize. Subtle changes that most people would miss, but to a man who had survived 3 coup attempts in 18 months, these details were everything. "Marcus," Ibrahim said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "something's wrong." Before Marcus could respond, the convoy came to a complete stop. The engines died simultaneously, not the usual staggered shutdown they practiced for security reasons. This was coordinated, synchronized, professional. Ibrahim's hand instinctively moved to the Glock 19 concealed beneath his traditional bubu, while his eyes darted to the emergency communication device built into his wristwatch. The device was dead, completely disabled, as if someone had used an electromagnetic pulse specifically designed to neutralize its circuits. The rear door of his vehicle opened, and instead of Sergeant Konate, his usual escort, a tall figure in tactical gear appeared. The man's face was covered by a balaclava, but his build was unmistakable. It was David Richardson, the British ex-SAS operative who had been part of his inner security circle for the past 8 months. "President Traoré," David's voice was different, colder than usual, "please step out of the vehicle." Slowly.
Ibrahim esse mind raised.
David Richardson, the man who had thrown himself in front of a grenade during the market bombing in March, who had saved Ibrahim's life more times than he could count, who had become like a brother to him. The same David who knew every detail of Ibrahim's security protocols, his safe houses, his escape routes, his family's whereabouts.
"David, what is this?"
Ibrahim asked, his voice maintaining the calm authority that had carried him through countless crisis situations, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "This is $8 million worth of security training being put to use, sir. Just not in the way you expected." David's accent had changed slightly. The polished British tone was gone, replaced by something harder, more American. "Please, don't make this difficult."
"Step out of the vehicle."
Ibrahim glanced at Marcus, who was slowly reaching for his sidearm, but David was faster. "Colonel Diabra, I wouldn't recommend that. Your wife and children are safe, for now. But that depends entirely on your cooperation in the next few minutes." The color drained from Marcus's face. Ibrahim had never seen his old friend look so defeated, so utterly broken. It was in that moment that Ibrahim realized the true scope of what was happening. This wasn't just a betrayal by one man. This was systematic, planned, involving people who knew intimate details about all of their lives. As Ibrahim stepped out of the vehicle, his mind automatically catalogued everything around him. The courtyard that should have had 12 guards now had 30, all in tactical gear, all armed with weapons he recognized from his own military inventory. The second and third vehicles in his convoy hadn't moved. Their occupants were either dead or captured. "Walk," David commanded, gesturing toward the main building with an AK-47 that Ibrahim recognized as one of the weapons from his own armory. As they moved across the courtyard, Ibrahim's training kicked in. He began to notice details that would have escaped most people under such stress. The attackers weren't just wearing random tactical gear. They were using equipment that matched the specifications of his own security detail. They knew the compound's layout perfectly, moving with the confidence of people who had been here many times before. "How long?" Ibrahim asked as they approached the main entrance. "How long what?" David replied, though Ibrahim could tell he knew exactly what the question meant. "How long have you been planning this?"
How long have you been lying to me?
David was quiet for a moment as they entered the building. The hallways that Ibrahim had walked thousands of times now felt foreign, threatening. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Every doorway could be a trap. "The planning started the day you took power," David finally said. "But the lying?" "That started the day I took the job. You see, President Traoré, loyalty isn't something you can buy, no matter how much you spend on security. And $8 million buys a lot of very skilled people who understand that sometimes the highest bidder isn't the person signing the paychecks." They were heading toward the secure conference room in the basement, the same room where Ibrahim had made some of his most important decisions as leader. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Who's paying you?" Ibrahim asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "That's not really the right question," David said as they descended the stairs. "The right question is, how did you think you could change the economic relationships that have existed in this region for decades without consequences?" The basement level was dimly lit, and Ibrahim could hear voices coming from the conference room. As they got closer, he began to make out familiar sounds. His own voice, recorded conversations, phone calls that should have been private and secure. David opened the conference room door, and Ibrahim's worst fears were confirmed. Seated around the table were faces he recognized, not just his betrayers, but their handlers. Representatives from mining companies, defense contractors, and foreign governments who had seen their profits threatened by Ibrahim's policies of resource nationalism and military independence. At the head of the table sat a woman Ibrahim had met only once before, Catherine Morrison, supposedly a trade attaché from the Canadian embassy, but clearly much more than that. She looked up as he entered, her expression neither triumphant nor apologetic, just businesslike. "President Traoré," she said in perfect French, "please sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Ibrahim remained standing. "I take it this is about the mining contracts?" Catherine smiled thinly. "Among other things. You've been very disruptive to some very important relationships. The uranium deposits in the north, the gold mines in the east, these resources have strategic importance that goes far beyond your country's borders. So you decided to buy my security detail." "We decided to invest in people who understand global realities," Catherine corrected. "Your bodyguards, your intelligence chief, several members of your cabinet. They all came to understand that your vision for Burkina Faso, while admirable, was ultimately incompatible with regional stability." Ibrahim looked around the room and began to recognize more faces. There was General Ouedraogo, his own defense minister, sitting calmly at the table as if this were a routine cabinet meeting. There was Dr. Sankara, his economic advisor, the woman who had helped him design the very policies these people were now trying to undo. But it was the next face that truly shocked him. In the corner of the room, trying to avoid eye contact, sat Marie Cabaret, his personal secretary, the young woman who had access to his schedule, his private communications, his family's movements. The woman whose university education he had personally funded, whose mother's medical bills he had paid from his own pocket.
"Marie,"
Ibrahim said, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked up briefly, tears streaming down her face, then looked away again. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "They have my little brother." The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Ibrahim. This wasn't just about money or political power. This was about leverage, about finding pressure points in the lives of people around him and exploiting them systematically. How long have you been planning this specific operation? Ibrahim asked Catherine. Since you announced the new mining regulations 6 months ago. But we've been preparing for various scenarios since you took power. You have to understand, President Traoré, that your actions don't exist in a vacuum. When you nationalize foreign mining operations, when you kick out French military advisors, when you start talking about a Pan-African currency backed by gold reserves, these actions have consequences that ripple across multiple continents. David pushed Ibrahim into a chair at the opposite end of the table from Catherine. As he sat down, Ibrahim noticed that the chair was positioned so that he could see everyone in the room, but also so that everyone could see him. This was theater as much as it was politics.
What do you want?
Ibrahim asked. Resignation, Catherine said simply. A peaceful transition of power to someone more amenable to international cooperation. Your vice president has already agreed to take over temporarily, with elections to be held within 6 months under international supervision. Ibrahim laughed, a sound that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. You spent $8 million on my security detail, infiltrated my government, and threatened the families of my closest allies, and you think I'm going to simply resign? We think you're going to consider the alternatives, Catherine replied calmly. As if on cue, David placed a tablet on the table in front of Ibrahim. The screen showed surveillance footage from multiple locations: his sister's house in Bobo Dioulasso, his elderly mother's compound in his home village, the school where his nephew studied in Abidjan. These are live feeds, David said. All of these locations are currently under observation by our teams. Not threats, you understand, just observation. But the situation could change quickly depending on your decision. Ibrahim stared at the screens for a long moment, watching his family members going about their daily lives, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. His sister was hanging laundry in her backyard. His mother was preparing dinner. His nephew was playing football with friends in the schoolyard. You know, Ibrahim said finally, looking up at Catherine, I used to believe that the biggest threat to African leadership was corruption, leaders who sold out their own people for personal gain. But I was wrong. The biggest threat is people like you, who understand that everyone has something they can't bear to lose. We prefer to think of it as understanding human nature, Catherine replied. And my security detail, David, Marcus, the others, they all knew about this? David shifted uncomfortably. Not all of them. Marcus found out this morning. He's been resistant to the idea. That's why his family is part of the insurance policy. Ibrahim turned to look at Marcus, who was standing against the wall, still in shock.
And you, old friend? What's your price?
Marcus met his eyes for the first time since they'd entered the room. They don't just have my family, Ibrahim. They have documentation of the arms purchases we made through unofficial channels last year. If that comes out, it won't just be me who goes to prison. It'll be dozens of our people. The arms purchases. Ibrahim remembered those deals. Desperate times when they needed weapons quickly to fight the insurgency in the north, and official channels were too slow, too bureaucratic. They had worked through intermediaries, paid cash, avoided the paperwork that would have tied up the purchases for months while people died.
So you're all prisoners here too, Ibrahim observed.
We're all making difficult choices, Catherine corrected. The question is whether you're going to make the smart choice or the heroic choice. Because I can tell you from experience that in situations like this, the heroic choice tends to have a very high cost for everyone involved. Ibrahim looked around the room again, studying the faces of people he had trusted, people he had considered friends, people who had shared meals with his family and celebrated holidays in his home. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound he had ever experienced. But as he looked at them, he began to notice something else: subtle signs of distress, fear, guilt. These weren't hardened mercenaries who had sold out for money. These were people who had been systematically compromised, forced into impossible choices between their loyalty to him and the safety of people they loved. "There's something you don't understand," Ibrahim said to Catherine. "Which is, you've spent so much time studying African politics that you think you understand how we think, how we operate. But you've made a fundamental error." Catherine's expression didn't change, but Ibrahim could see David tense up slightly behind him. "You assume that personal survival is our highest priority. That we'll sacrifice anything, principles, country, future generations, to protect ourselves and our families in the short term." Ibrahim stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. "But you see, my generation of African leaders learned something from our predecessors' failures. We learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family, for your people, is to refuse to be compromised, even when the cost is almost unbearable." He turned to address the room.
Marie, Marcus, General Ouedraogo, Dottore Sankara, all of you.
I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. Ibrahim walked around the table, looking each person in the eye as he spoke. For the past 2 years, we've been building something together. Not just a government, but a model for what African leadership could look like in the 21st century. We've made mistakes, certainly. We've had to make difficult choices and sometimes work in moral gray areas. But the fundamental vision of a continent that controls its own resources, makes its own decisions, and refuses to be perpetually subordinated to external interests, that vision is bigger than any of us. He stopped in front of Marie, who was still crying. "Marie, your little brother is safe regardless of what happens here today. Because even if these people carry out their threats, even if they eliminate me and install a puppet government, the ideas we've been spreading don't die.
They grow stronger.
They inspire others. And eventually, they win." Catherine stood up abruptly. "This is very inspiring, President Traoré, but ideas don't stop bullets." "No," Ibrahim agreed, "but they do make bullets less effective. You can kill a man, but you can't kill a movement. And that's what you people have never understood about Africa. Every time you think you've solved the problem of African independence, it comes back stronger than before." David had moved closer during this speech, and Ibrahim could sense his tension. The British operative's training was telling him to end this conversation before it spiraled further out of control. "Time's up," David announced. "Ms. Morrison, we need a decision." Catherine looked at Ibrahim for a long moment, then nodded to David.
President Traoré, this is your last chance.
Resign quietly, and your family stays safe. Your allies keep their secrets. Everyone gets to go home. Ibrahim turned back to face her directly.
And if he refuse?
Then we move to more direct methods of persuasion. Catherine gestured to David, who produced another tablet. This one showed footage from inside the presidential compound itself, security cameras that revealed the full extent of the takeover. Armed men in tactical gear occupied every floor of the building. The staff who hadn't been compromised were being held in secured rooms. The compound's communication systems had been disabled.
We control everything, Catherine Said.
Your government thinks you're in a routine security meeting. Your military commanders think you're reviewing intelligence reports. No one is coming to help you, because no one knows you need help. Ibrahim studied the surveillance footage. The operation was indeed comprehensive, clearly planned by people who understood both the physical layout of his government and the psychological landscape of his inner circle. Very thorough, he admitted. You've obviously been working on this for a long time. Months of preparation, millions of dollars in investment, and some of the best operational minds in the private security industry, Catherine confirmed. This isn't amateur hour, President Traoré. This is what happens when you threaten interests that are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. I see. And after I resign, what happens to all these people who've been helping you? Do they get to go back to their normal lives, or do they become permanent assets? Catherine hesitated for just a moment before answering. That depends on their continued cooperation. Ibrahim looked around the room at the faces of his former allies. Do you all understand what that means? Once you cross this line, there's no going back. You'll never be free of these people. They'll own you for the rest of your lives. Dr. Sankara spoke up for the first time. Ibrahim, they have my daughter in Paris. She's been invited to stay at a particular hotel until this situation is resolved. General Ouedraogo added, my son's military scholarship in Belgium has been temporarily suspended. He's under protective custody until further notice. As Ibrahim listened to these revelations, he began to understand the true sophistication of the operation. These weren't just threats. They were a comprehensive system of control that had been built up over months, possibly years. How many of you are here voluntarily? Ibrahim asked. The silence that followed was answer enough. Ibrahim turned back to Catherine. You know, there's an old proverb in Burkina Faso, the hyena that eats with you today will eat you tomorrow. You've turned these people into accomplices, but do you really think they'll trust you after they've seen what you're capable of? Philosophy is interesting, President Traoré, but we're talking about immediate, practical realities. Are we? Because it seems to me that you're asking me to sacrifice the future of an entire generation of Africans for the temporary safety of a few dozen people. And while that might seem like a reasonable trade to you, it's actually a pretty terrible deal. Ibrahim walked over to the window, bulletproof glass that looked out onto a small courtyard where he had often met with visiting dignitaries. Through the glass, he could see more armed figures patrolling the grounds.
Let me ask you something, Messe Morrison.
How long do you think this arrangement will last? Say I resign today, your puppet government takes over, and everything goes back to the way it was before. How long before another disruptive leader emerges? How long before you have to do this all over again? That's not really your concern anymore. But it is, though.
Because, you see, you've made a fundamental miscalculation.
You think that by removing me, you're solving a problem. But I'm not the problem. I'm a symptom. The problem is that the old system doesn't work anymore. The problem is that a new generation of African leaders has figured out that we don't have to accept the deals our predecessors made. Ibrahim turned back to face the room. And even if you succeed today, even if you eliminate me and intimidate everyone else in this room, that knowledge doesn't disappear. It spreads. And the next leader who emerges with these ideas will be smarter, more careful, better prepared. David had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Enough talk, he said, raising his weapon. Ms. Morrison, this philosophical discussion isn't getting us anywhere. The longer we wait, the higher the risk of complications. Catherine nodded slowly. President Traoré, I appreciate your commitment to your ideals, but David is right. We need a decision now. Ibrahim looked at the gun in David's hands, a weapon he had authorized the purchase of, held by a man he had trusted with his life countless times. You know what the strangest part of this whole situation is? Ibrahim said. It's not the betrayal, really. Betrayal is as old as politics itself. It's not even the violence. I've been a soldier most of my life, and I understand that violence is sometimes part of political change. He paused, looking directly at David. The strangest part is that you actually think this will work. You think that by killing me or forcing me to resign, you'll be able to go back to business as usual. But you won't. Because this conversation, right here, right now, it's being recorded. The room went completely silent. Catherine's face went pale, and David's weapon wavered slightly. You see, Ibrahim continued, when you spend $8 million on the best security money can buy, you learn a few things about surveillance technology. And one of the things you learn is that the most important security measure isn't the one that protects you from your enemies. It's the one that protects you from your friends. Ibrahim reached into his pocket slowly, making sure his movements were non-threatening, and pulled out what looked like an ordinary pen. This device has been recording everything that's happened in this room for the past 45 minutes. Audio, video, and transmitting it in real time to secure servers in 3 different countries. Catherine stood up abruptly.
That is impossible. We disabled all communication systems in the building.
You disabled the official communication systems, Ibrahim corrected. But you didn't know about the unofficial ones. You see, when you're dealing with people who've spent their careers in intelligence and special operations, you quickly learn that redundancy isn't just important, it's survival. David was scanning the room frantically, looking for hidden cameras or transmission equipment.
Where is it? How are you broadcasting?
Ibrahim smiled. That's the beauty of modern technology, David. The surveillance system isn't in this room. It's built into the building itself. Microcameras in the air conditioning vents, acoustic sensors in the walls, transmission equipment hidden in places you'd never think to look. He turned to address Catherine directly. So here's the situation as it actually stands, Ms. Morrison. Everything that's happened here today, the threats to my family, the blackmail of my staff, the detailed confession of your organization's involvement in destabilizing African governments, all of it is now in the hands of journalists, human rights organizations, and intelligence agencies in multiple countries. Catherine's composure finally cracked.
You're lying.
Am I?
David, check your secure communication device.
I think you'll find that your handlers have been trying to reach you for the past 10 minutes. David pulled out an encrypted phone and checked the messages. His face went white as he read. What does it say?
Catherine demanded. Mission abort. David read aloud.
Immediate extraction.
Cover blown.
The room erupted in chaos. Several of the people who had been forced to participate in the plot looked relieved for the first time since Ibrahim had entered the room. Marie was openly sobbing, but now they seemed to be tears of relief rather than fear. Catherine was frantically making phone calls, trying to reach her superiors, while David and the other security operatives were arguing in hushed tones about extraction procedures. Ibrahim remained calm in the center of the storm, watching as the carefully orchestrated operation fell apart around him. The thing about building a house of cards, he said to no one in particular, is that it only takes one card being pulled out to bring the whole thing down. General Ouedraogo approached him cautiously.
Mr. President, what happens now?
To us, to our families. Ibrahim put a hand on his old friend's shoulder. Now we clean up this mess and figure out how to make sure it never happens again. As for your families, they were never in real danger. My counter-surveillance teams have been tracking and protecting all of them since this morning. But how did you know? I didn't know for certain, but I suspected. There had been too many small changes, too many coincidences. When David's behavioral patterns shifted 3 days ago, I activated emergency protocols that most of you didn't even know existed. Marcus finally spoke up from his position by the wall.
Ibrahim, I'm sorry.
They had photographs of my children walking to school. They knew my wife's daily routine. You don't need to apologize, Marcus. None of you do. What happened here today wasn't your fault. It was a sophisticated psychological operation designed to exploit your love for your families. The real blame lies with the people who thought they could buy and sell African sovereignty like a commodity. Catherine had finished her phone calls and was staring at Ibrahim with a mixture of respect and hatred. You knew. From the beginning, you knew this was going to happen. Not exactly. But I knew something like this was inevitable. When you start changing the fundamental economic relationships in a region, there are always consequences. The question was whether those consequences would find us prepared or unprepared. So what happens to us now? She asked. Ibrahim considered the question carefully. That depends on a lot of factors. How much damage has been done? How many other operations like this are currently in progress? How far up the chain of command this goes in your organization? And if we cooperate, then we might be able to find a way forward that doesn't involve everyone in this room spending the next 20 years in prison.
David laughed bitterly.
You think any of us are going to see the inside of a courtroom? People like us don't get arrested, President Traoré. We get reassigned to different continents and given new identities. Maybe in the old days, Ibrahim agreed. But things are changing. The International Criminal Court has been very interested in expanding its mandate to include economic crimes and political manipulation. And with the evidence we've gathered today, I think they'll have a very strong case. Over the next several hours, as the immediate crisis was resolved and the various parties were sorted out, Ibrahim had time to reflect on what had happened. The betrayal by his security detail had been painful, but it had also been educational. It had shown him vulnerabilities in his system that he hadn't previously understood, and it had given him insight into the sophisticated methods being used to undermine African leadership. More importantly, it had demonstrated that the old playbook, the one that relied on finding pressure points and exploiting personal weaknesses, wasn't as effective as it used to be. When leaders expected betrayal, prepared for it, and built systems that could survive it, the traditional methods of control began to lose their power. As the sun set over Ouagadougou that evening, Ibrahim sat in his office reviewing the intelligence reports that had been generated from the day's events. The scope of the operation against him had been impressive. Months of planning, millions of dollars in resources, and coordination between multiple international actors. But it had also been revealing in ways that its planners probably hadn't intended. The recordings from the conference room, combined with the digital evidence recovered from the operatives' equipment, had provided a detailed picture of how these operations worked, who funded them, and how they were coordinated across different countries. Marcus knocked on his office door and entered when invited. His friend looked exhausted but relieved. "The families are all safe," Marcus reported. "Your counter-surveillance teams had been monitoring the supposed threats since yesterday. No one was ever actually in danger." "Good. And our guests?" "Catherine Morrison and 3 of her associates are in secure custody pending extradition hearings. David Richardson and the other security operatives are cooperating with intelligence officials. The members of our staff who were compromised are receiving counseling and debriefing." Ibrahim nodded.
"And the international response?"
"Mixed, as expected. Some governments are expressing concern about the security situation. Others are quietly pleased that the operation failed. The mining companies involved are denying any knowledge of the plot, but their stock prices suggest the markets don't believe them." "What about the recording? How much of it has been released?" "The full recording is being held as evidence, but selected excerpts have been shared with journalists. The story is already breaking in several international outlets." Ibrahim leaned back in his chair and looked out the window at the city lights of Ouagadougou. "You know, Marcus, 6 months ago I would have considered today a disaster. The idea that our own security detail could be compromised, that our closest allies could be turned against us, it would have felt like the end of the world. And now I think it might have been exactly what we needed. Not the betrayal itself, but the test it represented. We've learned that our systems can survive sophisticated attacks. We've learned that our people, even when threatened and coerced, still chose to do the right thing when given the opportunity. And we've learned that our enemies aren't as smart or as powerful as they pretend to be." Marcus sat down across from his old friend. "Do you think they'll try again?" "Of course they will. But next time, we'll be better prepared. And more importantly, next time they won't be the only ones playing the game. Other African leaders have been watching what happened here today. They're learning from our experience, adapting our methods, building their own defenses."
"So what is next?"
Ibrahim smiled for the first time that day. "Next, we get back to work. We have a country to run, an economy to build, and a future to create. The difference is that now we know exactly how much some people are willing to pay to stop us." As Marcus left the office, Ibrahim remained at his desk, working on the speech he would give to the nation the following day. The attempted coup had failed, but the larger struggle continued. The $8 million that had been spent on his security detail had taught him valuable lessons about both loyalty and betrayal, about the price of independence and the cost of compromise. But most importantly, it had shown him that the future of African leadership lay not in avoiding these challenges, but in meeting them head-on, with preparation, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that sovereignty cannot be bought or sold, only earned and defended. The phone on his desk rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his sister, calling from Bobo Dioulasso. "Ibrahim, we saw the news reports."
"Are you safe?"
"I'm safe," he assured her. "We're all safe. And we're going to make sure it stays that way." As he spoke with his family members, updating them on the situation and reassuring them about their security, Ibrahim reflected on the irony of the day's events. The people who had tried to use his love for his family as a weapon against him had fundamentally misunderstood something crucial about African leadership in the 21st century. They had assumed that personal loyalty was stronger than political conviction, that individual survival was more important than collective progress, that the bonds of family and friendship could always be weaponized for political ends. But they had been wrong. The new generation of African leaders had learned to love their families precisely by refusing to compromise their principles, to protect their friends by building systems that couldn't be easily corrupted, to ensure their own survival by creating movements that were bigger than any individual. The $8 million betrayal had been intended to destroy Ibrahim Traoré's government and break the spirit of African independence. Instead, it had become a masterclass in how to survive and thrive in an environment where loyalty could be bought but conviction could not be sold. As Ibrahim finished his phone calls and returned to writing his speech, he realized that in some strange way he was almost grateful for what had happened. The attempted coup had been a test, and he had passed it. More importantly, his people had passed it, his system had passed it, and his vision for the future had passed it. Tomorrow he would tell the nation about what had happened, about the threats they faced and the defenses they had built. But tonight he would simply work on the speech that would help define the next phase of their journey toward true independence. The $8 million had been well spent, just not in the way its investors had intended. Instead of buying a betrayal, it had purchased a lesson in resilience, a demonstration of strength, and a blueprint for future success. And that, Ibrahim reflected as he worked late into the night, was probably the best return on investment his enemies could have hoped for, even if it wasn't the return they had been expecting.